some of the questions I get right away is like, why textbooks? These big, massive, boring textbooks that are out there. Why do you sit around and read all these all the time here? So to start with, I was actually a classroom teacher. I was a middle school and high school teacher for a number of years here in Minnesota. And what I noticed over the years here is that when my students would come to my class, I always kind of got the same, oh, history's so boring. Why do we have to do this? This is such a useless class. And I just kind of kept getting told this again and again and again. I kept thinking, well, that's kind of weird because I find it just to be this really fascinating topic. Yet my students just really seem to be bored in the classroom. And what I kind of discovered after a while is that what I found so interesting about it, which is there are different interpretations and there are different biases and there are different perspectives that people bring to history all the time that kind of keeps it changing. So I need to try to figure out something to do along with that. So I was thinking, okay, how do I show my students this? And I happened to be in I was getting a master's degree in history, and I was in a graduate level course. And the professor was talking, and he had been in Russia and he had studied in Russia. And we got to World War II, and he started talking about the end of World War II. And he goes, oh, by the way, it's kind of interesting. Russian textbooks very rarely mention, this would have been back in like the 1970s and 80s when he was a student over there. He said they very rarely mentioned the atomic bombs. He said there might be a little footnote or, oh yeah, by the way, the US dropped a couple of bombs, stuff like that. But according to Russian history textbooks, they claim that once they declared war against Japan, you can see that within 5 days, Japan surrenders and World War II comes to a complete end. So that was their perspective. And I remember sitting in that class going, well, that's just wrong. That's not the way I learned it. So it has to be obviously wrong here. There's no question about that. And I started thinking, well, if the Russians were saying that and they disagree with us, who is saying other things about us as well? So this leads to what historiography is, which is the history of history or the study of history. Like, what has impacted the way we learn this over time? How do we see things differently? How do we understand other people's viewpoints as well? So a colleague of mine and we started doing some research into this, and we discovered over in Germany, there's an institute called the George Eckert Institute, and it's in Braunschweig, Germany. And they are a UNESCO site, so the UN actually sponsors them, and they collect history textbooks from around the world. So they have this repository, this library of like probably about 90,000 to 100,000 history textbooks over time from all these different countries there as well. So I got a couple of fellowships, had the chance to go over, and we started collecting all these different textbooks and putting them together. And then just by doing that, I started to discover too that there's a purpose for history textbooks beyond just, hey, students read all this information here. And what I usually tell future teachers now is that the purpose of a history class is to create future citizens. And so these are civic lessons. I can give a quick example. If the teacher in the classroom wouldn't mind helping me out, can you go around and ask everybody, if you think of a cover of your US history textbook or your US government textbook, what are the things you guys usually see on the textbook cover? Yeah, if you think about the images, and you're exactly right. I mean, the American flag, the Lincoln Memorial, the crossing of the Delaware, flag raising at Iwo Jima. The one I always find kind of interesting is the Alamo shows up on a lot of history textbooks, which I always find kind of funny because that was technically a loss, but it says something about Americans if you know the entire story behind it as well. So you can just see, just by looking at the cover of these textbooks, there's a message we're trying to get to future generations. And within these books is a roadmap as to how you can become a better citizen. And every country does this. We had a chance to look at a textbook from Malta, and I was looking at this, and they were going through and explaining, if you're going to be Maltese, these are the things that made us great over the time. And they started connecting to all these great world moments in history. And during World War II, this happened here. And during the Cold War, they were doing this. And we were here. We were right in the center of all this. So if you want to be a future citizen of our country, these are the things that you're going to need. Well, we started going through all these textbooks, and we were getting them translated, and we're starting to read the different stories that were out there. And so some of the ones that had jumped out at us that people usually have quick questions about. The first one is almost always North Korea comes up. A lot of people have seen the North Korean textbooks, and their version of history and our version of history, especially when it comes to like the Korean War. I was surprised to find out that the North Koreans won the Korean War. And they did so by their great and powerful leader. and they thwarted the Americans from coming in, and they pushed them off the continent. And reading through all this, I thought, man, this does not sound anything like what our textbooks are saying whatsoever here. So you see some of those things. By the way, this is a quick, interesting side note. In North Korea, in their math textbooks, we came across, and because we were focusing on history, we would include this, but in their math textbooks, they'd have programs like, if you pointed your gun south and there were 15, the reference is usually devil dogs, meaning either South Koreans or Americans who are living there. And they use devil dog. It's a really terrible thing in their language, meaning that Americans, as they see, we're not pure like North Koreans are. We've got all these mixed in groups of people and stuff like that. And it was just ridiculous things like, if you shoot your gun and you kill 10 of the 15 that were standing in front of you, how many do you have left and stuff like that? And it's like, okay, wow, that is a unique math lesson that they've got. So that they go through and have a number of things like that as well. Countries that we thought we looked at it, we said, well, there's not going to be really anything here, but we'll read and see what they have to say. England was extremely surprising to us, because the English seem to have a lot of different interpretations of things. One, which we kind of probably should have thought would have been obvious, but the American Revolution, their version of the textbook, first of all, the Sons of Liberty that we hold up, going back to what was said before about how patriotic and how these textbooks are and stuff like that. The Sons of Liberty in British textbooks are terrorists. They make no bones about it. These were horrible individuals who were thwarting the law, causing numerous problems. There's one textbook that refers to George Washington as an executioner, that he was killing his own men. And they kind of explain these men were deserting. They didn't want to fight for the American cause anymore. So George Washington had them killed. There's some truth to that, but the way it was written was like, George is just walking around going, oh, you deserted. We're going to execute you. We're going to execute you, and things like that as well. And then the thing that I found the most interesting, again, going back to my World War II area, is that what we refer to here as the special relationship. And I actually heard this on a sitcom not too long ago, and referring to the United States and England by saying, we have this special relationship, which means to us, we are really good friends. We're the best of friends, and we get along, and we agree in foreign policy and everything else like that. And that came out of World War II because Churchill and FDR were so close and stuff. What's interesting is in the 2000s, that story disappears, and British textbooks make a special point of saying the special relationship was a myth. Basically, the Americans came in, kicked down the door, and said, this is how we want things done. This is going to be the way we do it, things like that. I like to ask people this question. I'll throw it out to all of you as well. It's tricky Trivial Pursuit, so I'll understand if you don't know. But by the late 1990s, early 2000s, so by about 2004, 2005, the special relationship in British textbooks disappears, and it's now all of a sudden referred to as a myth. Whenever you do historiography, you always got to look at the date of when things were written and go, okay, why would it have changed at this time? Do any of you have any guesses or ideas? Why in the early 2000s do the British all of a sudden start saying this special relationship never really existed? If you look back and see when the war on terror starts, the British are going to be willing to send in troops, but then they get stuck in this war that all of a sudden they say, well, this really wasn't our war. We got stuck with it, and we got drug into it because of the Americans. So the special relationship becomes a myth for them over there. So yeah, exactly the problem they have. Canada, real quick, the last two things, I'm going to open it up to questions for everybody here, is that Canadian textbooks, same type of thing. We thought, oh, our 51st state, the neighbors to the north, we get along beautifully. There's not going to be a difference. Wow. Canadian textbooks go after American culture. They do not like McDonald's. They don't like MTV. They don't like all the things that are being flooded into their country. They think they're losing some of their identity because of all that. And I never thought about this, but if you go back to like the War of 1812, Canada was invaded by the United States because we were fighting Britain. In Canadian textbooks, they refer to it as an invasion against Canada. And they even say that they became a nation because of that constant fear of the United States invading them. So they needed to form their own nation, have their own government, own military and stuff like that, because of this constant fear of what was going to happen as well. And the last thing I'll leave you with, is because a lot of students I get this question a lot too. 9/11, what happened on 9/11 is interesting. It shows up in almost, I can't think of a history textbook around the world that doesn't talk about 9/11. What we found interesting, though, what I've in my research, is that textbooks from around the world like to say, yes, what happened in 9/11, horrible, horrible tragedy, no question asked. But then they go on to say, this wasn't the only terrorist act that happened in the world. And they're insinuating, in my personal opinion, that, okay, yeah, it happened to America, and America's so important, and they think the whole world revolves around them. But there's been terrorism going on in all these other countries and all these other places and stuff like that. And they almost always list, this is what happened in Japan, this is what happened in this country, and places like that, with all these different terrorist attacks. So it always kind of puts it in a larger global perspective too, of going, okay, this is what matters to us, and this is what matters to them. And when I was over at the Eckerd Institute, I always thought this was really interesting. We had a bunch of scholars from around the world, and we got into this conversation, and they were kind of being a little harsh on the United States, in my personal opinion. And finally, somebody said, okay, you need to understand, people from around the world see the US in two different lights. One, we hate your government and military. We don't like your government. We don't like your military intruding all the time. But we love the American people. We love the culture. We love movies, music, and everything else that comes along with it too. So we have this kind of split relationship around the world, where there's kind of this love-hate going back and forth because of their perceptions of us, which I think comes a lot from their understanding of their own history.